When this is going to start, it'll be another. Good afternoon. I'm Duke Snyder, and I teach anthropology here at North Idaho College. Anthropology is the science of man. Physical anthropology is the study of the biological history and the biological nature of man. Cryptozoology is the study and search for hidden and/or unexpected animals. Dr. Grover Krantz, our guest today, does all of them. Dr. Krantz earned his BA and MA degrees in anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. He earned his PhD at the University of Minnesota with research concerning the origin of man. Since receiving his master's degree in 1958, Dr. Krantz has authored or co-authored 65 publications, 16 of which are concerned with his topic today, Sasquatch. It is interesting to note that only 25% of his publications concern Sasquatch, yet it is with this subject that many of us would most readily associate him. I first became aware of Dr. Krantz through an article he wrote for the journal Current Anthropology in 1968 entitled Brain Size and Hunting Ability in Earliest Man. I still have my students read the article today. He has had a very productive career in anthropology. Currently, he is organizing a symposium for the 1988 American Anthropological Association meetings. He is reconstructing and making casts of several hominoid fossils. He is preparing a book about unknown hominoids. He is a member of the editorial boards of both Northwest Anthropological Research Notes and Evolutionary Theory. He is on the board of directors of the International Society of Cryptozoology. And lest we forget, among all his achievements and current activities, he is also an associate professor of anthropology at Washington State University and has a regular teaching obligation. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you a very special guest to our campus, anthropologist and cryptozoologist, Dr. Grover Krantz. Please welcome him.
Thank you. And I can tell by the echoes that my little gadget here is working. Well, to begin with, I just want to make one very quick comment and return to it later, and that concerns a good deal of adverse publicity that's come out in the media on me and my work on this Sasquatch business over the last 3 weeks. I will discuss this in a little more detail towards the end of the talk, but suffice it to say now that the news releases that some of you may have seen on the subject in newspaper articles are very incorrect. There are omissions, there are distortions, and there are some flat-out, absolutely opposite the truth material that's been publicized recently. I will make use of the later part of this hour to correct some of that. Might even raise some discussion. But now, to begin with, I should familiarize you with what this topic is, the Sasquatch or Bigfoot, two names for exactly the same creatures. I'm sure some of you are already fairly aware of it. Some think you are, but are in fact somewhat in error. And some of you may not have any clear idea at all. Basically, there are a lot of people who report seeing a strange creature, animal, in the forests, mostly in the Pacific Northwest. I don't deal with elsewhere, so I'll stick to this area. What people describe is something that stands maybe 8 feet tall. That's up about here. I'm tapping a Sasquatch on the top of the head, but you can't see him. That weighs perhaps 800 pounds, possibly more. Stands upright like a human being, that is, walking on 2 legs. Arms hanging down to the side. It's covered with body hair or fur, rather like a bear, and it has a face and head that somewhat resembles a gigantic gorilla. Well, If you hear stories like this, the first reaction is to just put it down to somebody's overenthusiasm, sort of given a bodily form to the boogeyman or some strange things like that. If there are several people who have reported this, you don't take it too seriously, because there's a few out there who've seen unicorns and goblins and gremlins and all kinds of strange creatures. If there are a dozen reasonably competent people and only half of them were drunk at the time of their reports, you still wouldn't take it too seriously. But when you have reports in excess of 1,000 people that have seen these things, including deputy sheriffs, prominent religious people, and the head of the Canadian Humane Society, then you start to wonder, maybe there is something to it. Well, with that amount of eyewitness evidence, I would take the possibility seriously that there's something out there, but I wouldn't be convinced of it. There's a lot of people that report a lot of things, and I don't see that they've got a convincing case. The numbers get pretty high. By the way, I should mention that when I say over 1,000 people are on record, I have read accounts and been aware of this many. But I have actually talked in person to 61 people who claim to have seen these creatures. 34 of these people, by my best judgment, I can't find anything wrong with their stories. They seem to be legitimate, they're responsible people, and there's nothing inconsistent, and they're not cut and dried neat stories that were rehearsed. They just seem genuine stories. The rest of them, a little less than half, are a combination of what I'm convinced are lies, misidentifications, or quick sightings that were too brief to really amount to anything. Well, with a track record of somewhere near 50% of what I've run across and talked to people personally, I would say of the 1,000 reports, maybe half of them are accurate. On the other hand, how many people actually report it if they see a creature like that? If you come in from deer hunting someday and your friend asks you, well, did you shoot a deer? No, I see you don't have one. Well, what happened to you today? Well, I saw this thing about yay big, monstrous shoulders. And well, a lot of people do report a thing like that. They get joked at, accused of lying, making up a stupid story, and they just shut up. Some people are smart enough to think ahead, realize what reception they are going to get, and they never talk about it. I've run into a few of these who haven't talked for many years. They found out that I was interested in it, that I took it seriously, and then they very sheepishly came up and told me what happened to them 2 years, 5 years, 20 years ago, whatever it was. So if we have 1,000 people who claim to have seen these things, and half of them are telling the truth, that's the number that's on record. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there's 10 times that many who haven't talked. Well, you ought to have something more than just eyewitness accounts. You can send somebody to the electric chair or gas chamber in most states in the United States on the strength of 2 eyewitnesses to a murder, for instance, and yet we've got 1,000 eyewitnesses on record. Well, that's enough to execute 500 people, but it's not enough to convince the scientists that the Sasquatch exists. Quite frankly, it would not have been enough to convince me. It would be enough to make me take it seriously, but not to be convinced. When I started studying this, the first thing I wanted to do was see some footprints. Lots of people have recorded footprints. Some have just seen them, looked at them, and said, wow. Some have photographed them, measured them. Some have made plaster casts of them, and I will show you a few plaster casts here. These have been the most intriguing to me, and perhaps I'll just show you a couple of them right now. I've done some corrections or some detailing on one surface, so I'll just show you the backside first. This just to give you an idea of how big these things are. This is what I would consider a run-of-the-mill footprint of an adult male Sasquatch. You may notice the size of my foot compared to that. And that's a shoe that's a lot bigger than my foot. My shoe is 12 inches long. The foot inside is 11 inches long. This footprint is 17 inches long. If it had a shoe on it, it would be more like 18 and a half. That's a lot of foot. 2 footprints were reported in large numbers a little bit to the northwest of here, back in late 69, early 70. Again, here's the bottoms of the two tracks. These were alternating regularly, and it's obvious that we're dealing here with either somebody who made a very clumsy fake because they weren't mirror images of one another, or it was a crippled Sasquatch. Well, I studied these in great detail back in 1970, and I made a reconstruction of the probable bone structure, and this, with some little bit of cute painting, is what I got. Here the bones are indicated by white, and the rest of the foot just painted a light brown. What I found was that while the 2 feet did not match each other, I could make separate bones and reconstruct the probable structure. And it was obviously very badly crippled. But one of the things I noticed in particular was a point right here, which is where the main weight of the body would rest. This is the top bone where the ankle comes in. If you made an enlarged human foot, just took a standard foot and spread it out to 17 inches, the weight of the ankle would be back about here, towards the rear. But this is shifted forward. I did some more calculating and realized that if it was made by actually an 8-foot tall, 800-pound creature, it would have to have the ankle shifted forward for mechanical correction, because the bigger you are, the stronger you are, but your weight is even greater. Strength gets ahead of weight, and you have to change the leverage of the foot. Well, it turned out that the shift of the ankle that I could reconstruct was exactly the amount necessary to carry an 800-pound body. My reasoning from that point, since there's no other possible explanation of these things, it's either a modern fake or Sasquatch, my reasoning was that if this was faked, it had to be done by an expert anatomist who could figure out exactly how to do all these calculations, how to make the foot show the crippled effect so that very subtly, so that only another expert anatomist could figure out where the bones were and deduce where the weight was on the ankle and so on. So it had to be a brilliant, inventive human anatomist of great skill, and I don't think there's been anybody like that since Leonardo da Vinci. I decided that all the qualifications of the faker were so impossible that I would have to rule that out. That left only one other explanation for those footprints, namely the Sasquatch, which I would consider absolutely ridiculous. But if every alternative is impossible, the final one, the remaining one, however ridiculous it may be, has to be the truth. So ever since the spring of 1970, I've been convinced that these things are real. Since then, I've been gathering additional information on it. I'll show you just a couple of other things here. Well, quite a few others, actually. Some not quite so big footprints. These are not the original plaster casts out of the ground. I make molds, and I can make exact copies of them with a little bit of difficulty. So that's why these are so white and clean. These are 2 feet of another individual. These were picked up in the summer of 1982. They were particularly interesting because they have what are impressions of what we call dermal ridges. I'll explain those. On your fingerprints, which you're all aware of, you have little ridges on your fingers, a ridge and furrow system. They're a 0.5 millimeter apart. That makes about 50 to the inch. And these make your fingerprints. You have this ridge and furrow system all over the palm of your hand. That's not to be confused with the wrinkles or the flexion creases. It's the fingerprint type marks. They're all over your palms. You also have them on the undersides of your toes and the bottom of your soles of your feet. You have these, palms and soles. All apes have them, all monkeys have it, and it stops there. Well, we have a fair indication of dermal ridges from the toes and from scattered places along the sole of the foot of both of these tracks. This was expectable if you consider that the soil in which these particular tracks were picked up, this is the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington. If the soil is extremely fine, it's slightly damp at the time the impressions are made, and the casts are made within 24 hours or sooner. These were apparently made less than 2 hours after the thing walked by. then you can get dermal ridges. I was a little bit uncertain whether this could be real, so I tested it with a piece of dirt, rather fine soil from the backyard of my own house. I had a little clot of dirt, worked it around in my hand, stuck my thumb in it, looked up, and I could see my dermal ridges in the dirt very nicely. So I set it aside, got some plaster, mixed it up, a tablespoonful, poured it in, let it sit, dry, washed the dirt off, and by golly, there was a copy of my thumb in plaster, and I could see my fingerprint perfectly clearly. Well, that established to my satisfaction that finding tracks like this with dermal ridges was certainly a possibility. Well, these are a pair of tracks of one individual, right and left foot, that were, these are not terribly big. These are about 14.5 inches. I would assume it's an adult female individual, but there's no way I can really demonstrate that. Simply that it's a good deal smaller than the other one. Though I should say there is one indication that this is an adult female. Oh, by the way, the toes didn't track all the way here, so those are short. These tracks were picked up in 1982. Additional tracks of the same individual were found, and we can recognize the individuals fairly easily, in the same area in 1987. So 5 years had passed, and the tracks were about a half an inch longer. There's no way this could be a young male still growing up. It has to be full grown at this time. And since it didn't achieve 17 inches or anywhere near, we would assume that it's an adult female. This is another interesting piece of plaster. It's the imprint of what appears to be knuckles and thumb into the ground. So what we're looking at here are knuckles of 4 fingers, a thumb, and a very clearly marked thumbnail on the end of that. The creature had put its knuckles down, lifted up, and a cast was made of that. If you want to know what an entire hand looks like, we have one. The authenticity I cannot guarantee, but I can't see any other way. This appears to be a handprint of one that was picked up in northeastern Washington. The claim of the person who found it was that the Sasquatch must have been down on its hands and knees, digging something in the ground, drawing dirt backwards, and upon standing up, did just what you would do, put the hand on the dirt and give a little shove and come to an erect position. And that was the imprint of the hand as it shoved its way up. Well, there's lots more evidence than this. As I said, I've got an awful lot of tracks. I have casts of something like 65 different hand and footprints, overwhelmingly footprints. There are a few other handprints, though. And these 65, I can break it down to 20 different individuals. It's possible that there are more individuals represented in my sample than just the 20. There's one batch of footprints where they're highly variable, and it may actually be 2 or 3 different individuals, but I have 20 at rock bottom. The 20 individuals who I can recognize from footprints come from just a few very limited areas where Sasquatch activity has been reported. So limited that I would be surprised if I have footprints of even 1% of the Sasquatches that actually live in the Pacific Northwest. Accordingly, if I have 1% of them, and that's 20, that means there are about 2,000 of them out there. If I have less than 1% of them, then there are more than 2,000. I think that's a reasonable guess of the population. There's one hunter I know who's probably tracked and investigated these things more than any other human being, and he guesses upwards of 10,000 of them. I don't know if his estimate is very good. But I do have to mention this population figure because there's a fair number of people that come up with, what if there's only one Sasquatch? Well, I know 20 of them. I would like to say I almost know them personally, which isn't quite true. But there is no doubt that there is a fairly large population of them out there. By species standards, 2,000 is not really terribly large, but it may be comparable to the number of mountain lions in the Pacific Northwest. It's certainly nowhere near the population of bears. 2,000 may be a respectable population, but it's still rather scarce by animal standards. Thank you. Gin.
Oh, good.
Well, some people ask, is this, what is this creature? What do we know about it? Can we say anything about its habits or anything else? Well, we can say a few things. For instance, the size estimate I'm usually adhering to, without being absolutely sure, is 8 feet tall, 800 pounds for a male, 7 feet tall, 500 pounds for a female. At least these would be ballpark figures. We do have a movie film that a lot of you have probably seen, perhaps in special movies or specials and TV specials on the Sasquatch. It was made by Roger Patterson a little over 20 years ago, where the Sasquatch runs or walks past from left to right, and the thing is about 200 feet away, and the film is rotten, but you can see at least something is out there. I think that film is real. I've seen 8 other films of Sasquatches walking by, standing, thumbing their noses at you and various things. 8 other films, and I know they're all fake. At least in 2 of them, I not only know it's fake, but I know who was in the monkey suit. And I got a pretty strong idea who was in the monkey suit on the 3rd one. But 5 others, I just simply know that just nothing would behave like that, and it is not a reasonable animal. In the case of Roger Patterson's movie, however, I haven't been able to find anything wrong with it, nor has anybody else who makes any sense. A lot of people have, of course, looked at Roger Patterson's film and said, well, I know it's a fake. That's perfectly obvious. I can see the zipper on the back of the suit. Well, if you start out by looking at a Sasquatch film, knowing before you see it that that there is no such thing as a Sasquatch, then when you see the film, the obvious deduction is it must be a fake. If it is a film of a Sasquatch and the animal doesn't exist, then the film is a fake. The conclusion follows from the premises. But if you see Patterson's film without making the presumption that there is no such animal, but just have an open mind, I don't know anyone yet who has come away from that film thinking that it was a fake film. For that matter, I don't know anyone who is convinced that the Sasquatch doesn't exist who has looked at some of these footprints that I've got here. The only people I know of who are absolutely sure that there is no such thing as a Sasquatch, or a population of them, are the people who have not carefully looked at any of these casts. Now, the question of what might a Sasquatch be in the fossil record, perhaps. If it's a thing that's alive today, maybe we already know it from fossils. If it's closely related to humans and apes, then it might be something that we have. Well, there's a good possibility of that. There are a lot of fossil hominoids, that means ape-human category, and hominids, that is, things related to humans in terms of upright posture. There's a lot of them that are known in the fossil record that are not known to be existing in the world today. One of these may well be surviving, and it is alive today. I've looked over all of the possibilities from the earliest and most primitive, which would be Gigantopithecus, most people refer to it as an ape, up to the most recent and most advanced, which would be the Neanderthal man. Most of you know that as Neanderthal, but that's incorrect. It's a German word. It's Neanderthal. And I've checked these, and everything in between to see which one seems possibly to fit the Sasquatch. And I've settled on the earliest one, the Gigantopithecus, as being a very good candidate for our Sasquatch. I will show you some material on this. We have fossils of Gigantopithecus, but not a very impressive lot. Here, for instance, is a cast of the lower jaw of the biggest, most complete specimen of a Gigantopithecus. This is the lower teeth, 3 of them are missing, and the jaw that is involved in the tooth-bearing part, but the back and rising part of the jaw is missing. This comes from China. Its date is somewhere between 0.5 and 1 million years of age. There are two others similar to this, about another 1,000 teeth, and there's another jaw that's been found in India that matches the type quite closely. This one happens to be the largest of all of the jaws, but there's another one that looks very nearly the same size and it's immature. We're assuming that this is probably a typical male. When its teeth are compared with the 1,000 loose teeth, it turns out that, yes, there seems to be the teeth, you can divide them into two categories, the large teeth and the small teeth. We presume they're males and females. You average the large teeth, compare them with this jaw, and this is, typical or a little bit small. So the average male Gigantopithecus might have had a jaw a little bit bigger than this. Now, to give you an idea of how big this is, we might compare it with a human jaw. Just show you the tooth-bearing part of the jaw, and there's Gigantopithecus. It rather outclasses a human rather badly, and this is a jaw pretty near the size of mine. Well, how about a big ape, a gorilla? There's a male gorilla jaw. Biggest accepted known primate, 400 pounds, and there's Gigantopithecus. Beats it silly. Twice as thick, twice as tall, half again longer. Well, one can do a little more with this jaw than just hold up the cast of the original discovery and say, wow, ain't that cute? One can study it a little bit in a little more detail and find, for instance, that the teeth are intermediate between ape and human. There is no living animal that has teeth intermediate between ape and man. There's some clear differences between ape and human teeth. This third tooth, so we had a couple of them that were missing, replaced here. This is the third tooth, the canine tooth, the fang. That is big, but it's not as big as in the gorilla. It's intermediate. The fourth tooth here is a slicing tooth in the gorilla. It's a grinding tooth in a human. And in this case, it's in between, but it's a little more towards the human grinding design. These teeth are intermediate, but lean towards the human design slightly. Also, the spread of the jaw at the back, it's diverging very widely. We might compare the human and the ape on that. Here, the gorilla jaw, yes, the two backs of the jaw are diverging, but sort of V-shaped, not very wide. Human is much wider, and so is the Gigantopithecus. It's spreading at a much wider rate. Well, one could make a conclusion, at least tentatively from that what's going on here is that the back of the Gigantopithecus jaw is so wide because its neck is in there, in the area between the back halves of the jaw. If it's a gorilla, the neck is out behind and the jaw can be narrow. But if you stand it up on its hind legs and make it stand erect and poise the head on top of the neck, then the neck has to be between the jaws and it forces the jaws to be wide. Well, we simply ask, why else does this have such extremely wide spreading back of the jaw? If not for the neck, is there any other reason? No one has any idea of another reason. One could conclude from that maybe this is an erect animal. It wasn't walking around on its knuckles or on all fours. It's certainly too big to climb in trees. So when it was walking around on the ground, maybe it stood up and walked in a human manner. Interesting possibility, at least. Well, considering how big it is, so much bigger than a 400-pound male gorilla, we must be dealing with something that's at least twice the size of a male gorilla. It's not just the teeth that are big, the whole jaw, everything is big. So that must be a big creature. 800 pounds would be a reasonable guess, maybe even more. Well, if it's erect in posture, weighs 800 pounds, erect posture involves a lot of balancing problems, and if you get that tall, in order to work effectively, you have to, or get very tall, you have to build an extremely muscular body to handle that height. The very tall basketball players you see are exceptional individuals, and they rarely go much over 7 feet tall, and you never get an 8-foot tall basketball player. They can't function at 8 feet. So if you're going to have a very gigantic biped, it's going to have to be very heavy set. That's the best way to design one. You can't build a human that big, but you can build a biped with some very clever or careful designing. But you would end up making a very heavy set thing, so the 800 pounds, instead of being 10 or 12 feet tall, would probably only be about 8 feet tall. Very powerfully built. Well, if this Gigantopithecus is to be reconstructed a little bit further, let's consider his time, between 500,000 and 1 million years ago. At that time, we already had early hominids, true humans, known as Homo erectus. They were running around making stone tools, hunting, and presumably communicating with one another. We've got their fossil remains. They had brains 2/3 the size of modern people. They looked halfway human at least. Quite different from this Gigantopithecus. So obviously this animal was not involved in human ancestry, and so we don't presume any human traits. No particular intelligence, and since it wasn't a hunting animal, it probably, at least not hunting the way humans do, it probably had a full coat of hair. So our description of Gigantopithecus ends up being something like 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, walking on 2 legs, broad shoulders like any ex-arm swinger, like we in the apes are, covered with hair, and without very much brain, it would probably have a very ape-like face. Well, now that's this description of Gigantopithecus. Well, that's exactly the description of the Sasquatch. All we have to do is get them from China over into North America at some time in the last 500,000 years, and the problem is solved. Now, some people have objected to trying to reconstruct such a large animal simply on the basis of teeth. Well, I must remind people that we're not just dealing with teeth, we're also dealing with the entire lower jaw. More reconstruction can be made. The back of the jaw goes a distance back compared to the teeth. You take a certain number of teeth and extend that behind, and you have the back of the jaw. It works for humans, apes, the same. Take the height of the jaw, multiply that 2 times, and you know how tall it is. And the back of the jaw spreads following the same direction of the parts we've got here. And to reconstruct the entire lower jaw of a Gigantopithecus is relative child's play. It took an awful lot of work on my part, but maybe not every kid could do it, but a lot of kids could. There's very little leeway for possible error on this. So now comparing the entire lower jaw with a gorilla, now you can appreciate a little more the difference in size that's involved. This is an enormous creature. Well, should also compare it with the human jaw, just to remind you how small and insignificant we are compared to one of these guys. Well, after making this reconstruction of the lower jaw, people for some time would ask me, well, how about the rest of the skull? What would that look like? And my answer usually consisted of, well, the upper teeth, we've already got examples of them. Even if we didn't, we could match them with the lowers. They spread out a little bit farther. They overlap a little, match on the 3rd molar, overlap the rest of the way. You can estimate things fairly easily. The brain would be located right here, right where my fist is. From the tops of the jaw here be half in front and half behind, 9/10 above, 1/10 below. That's exactly the way it is in humans, apes, everything. We just don't know the size. Well, how big would the brain be? Well, I'm estimating what we call 600 cubic centimeters. A chimp is 400, a gorilla is 500, weighs twice as much. This weighs twice as much as a gorilla, so I'd also add another 100. 600 cubic centimeters is just a little over half a quart. That'd be about the amount of brain that you expect to run an ape body, ape-like body, that is ape intelligence, this size. And all the reports seem to indicate ape-like intelligence, so we know we can put a brain of about that size. We get the upper jaw, and a big crest on the back of the head supporting the neck muscles. Instead of going up the way it is in a gorilla to hook to the neck that goes back, you put it straight out behind to hook to a neck that goes vertically. Well, I was asked about this many times, and I give my standard answer, and then some of my more disrespectful students would comment like, why don't you put your hands where your mouth is and make one? So I did. This, as nearly as I can calculate it, would be the skull of a Gigantopithecus. I will be interested to see if we ever recover a full Gigantopithecus skull or the major part of it. We might get something this big. Now, bear in mind that this is covered with hair, muscles, skin, fat, and it would just be absolutely enormous compared to my head. You'd be talking, well, cut off at the lower edge of the jaw, you're talking 80 pounds of head here. Well, since this is my reconstruction of what I think Gigantopithecus looked like, I've also compared this with people's opinions and judgments of Sasquatch. Most of the time, there's not much that can be done to compare, because most of the people who've seen a Sasquatch don't have any idea of what kind of skull there might be inside of that head. Most of the people who can appreciate a reconstruction like that and study it and be fascinated with it have never seen a Sasquatch. Fortunately, I found one exception to this rule in the form of a man named Robert Titmus, who is an expert taxidermist, very familiar with animal skulls and relating the skull to the outside appearance of the head. He's not a scientist in the normal sense of the word, but he's certainly a scientist of taxidermy. And he's also seen Sasquatches on a couple of occasions, one full in the face and reasonably close. He looked at the reconstruction, studied it at great length, and he pronounced that that is just the kind of skull he thinks would be inside of a Sasquatch's head. He only made one comment of contrast. He thought the eyes of his Sasquatch would be farther apart than the eye sockets on that skull. Well, my reaction to that is, well, I only guessed on placing the eyes. I just took a gorilla spacing and increased it in proportion to the size. Bob Titmus's recollection, because it was something like 40 years ago, could be wrong. Or maybe the Gigantopithecus and the Sasquatch do in fact differ a little bit. There's any number of possibilities, and I think that's trivial. Well, anyway, if we got a skull of that size, obviously it needs an enormous body to carry it around. And I think it fits the description of the Sasquatch reasonably well. Now, what I might raise now is a general question of, okay, so that's the evidence for the Sasquatch. Who's supposed to believe it, and what do you do about it? If you people, after listening to my description here, believe this, I think you're a little bit gullible. Because there's a lot of things that I've said here that you cannot verify. Things that I say that I know, you don't know this. It's one step removed. You have to be a little bit careful. Maybe before I get into detailed discussion on that, I should go through these slides. These are just a few things to give you a few cute ideas. And then we'll get into some a little more serious. Here are three men pointing out footprints of Sasquatches. You can see the three fingers. That's one Sasquatch that walked by. The fellow in the blue shirt on the far left is Paul Freeman, who saw the creature. And this is a few hours later. He's got over shaking, and he and some Forest Service personnel are looking at the tracks of the one that he saw. He says it was 8 feet tall, must have weighed at least 800 pounds. It looked at him in a hostile manner. He looked at it in a very frightened manner. Even though Paul Freeman is a giant of a man himself, the creature was substantially larger than him. Now, this is just a close-up of one of the tracks. This is back in 1982 in the Blue Mountains, which is the source of two of the tracks that I have. Here's some boot prints, waffle boots, where, of course, the weight is going in on just half of the surface and goes in quite deeply. Here, the entire surface of the Sasquatch foot is pressed in at least as deep, if not deeper. So you know the thing must have weighed probably several times more than the human in the shoes. Here is just a single footprint of one of them. I'll call your attention to what appears in the center of the foot. That is a rock that's sitting in the ground, firmly braced in the ground. And the footprint went down around both sides of that rock and left impressions of dermal ridges on both sides. A cast of that very footprint was made, which I have here, and this is the indentation on the sole of the foot of where that rock was. That's stuck 2 centimeters into the sole of the foot. That's almost an inch. If you can imagine something hitting you in about the center of the sole of your foot and going in almost an inch, or for that matter, even half an inch, you would be limping probably for some months until the broken bones healed. You have a pad of fat on the underside of your foot. It is at most about 1/3 of an inch thick in that region of the foot. This indentation is very deep, and the animal or the creature, the thing, did not step on one side and roll around to get the impression all around it, because there's no breaks in the pattern of dermal ridges around it. It just stepped down, spread out, and lifted up again. So here we have an indication of how thick the pad is underneath the sole of the foot. And that, of course, is necessary for an extremely large, heavy animal to keep from jarring itself. So at least it shows internal consistency. Here is just another footprint. It's running sideways. Just another one to show you how big they are. Here's a pair of footprints. These are the two casts that I'm brought here, right and left feet. Actually, you're looking at the bottom of the feet, so the right foot is over here on my far side, and the left foot is here, since that's the bottom. I want to particularly call your attention to the one that did not step on the stone. That's the one closest here. There's a little plaster beyond the tips of the toes, but you can see 5 toes, and what may be an incipient 6th toe or just a pad of flesh. Fingerprint experts are unsure on that. Here is that footprint all by itself with the surplus plaster mostly cut off, and you see the footprint a little more clearly. But then a close-up of some of the toes. This is the 5th toe, and you can see with side lighting that there is a series of parallel lines, and also down here. These are fingerprint lines, the same sort of things in your fingertips. Here on the 2nd digit of the same individual, you can follow these arching patterns of lines back and forth across here. And here they run along here. Along this area of the toe, it's particularly interesting because here's where it was first noticed that there are little holes in the fingerprint lines. And somebody, the first person who looked at that, was a little bit puzzled and wondered why you get a hole in each of the lines right adjacent to one another. Then a 1/2 millimeter down, you get another pair of them, then another pair. They're not always paired off, but they tend to be, spaced about 1/2 millimeter apart. Well, those are sweat pores. That's exactly the positioning of the sweat pores in your fingertips and your soles as well. Some of the best fingerprint experts in the world have looked at these and pronounced them genuine. I remember particularly one fingerprint expert in the state of Wyoming. He first looked at that, saw the whole pattern of dermal ridges, and his reaction was, if that was done engraved by a counterfeiter, that counterfeiter is wasting his time. He should be counterfeiting money. And he's got such a good hand, such detailed work. That same expert then, when he looked more detailed and saw the sweat pores all over in it, he then said, no, that is too good. No counterfeiter can do that well. In other words, the most motivated engravers of detail in the world, namely those who are counterfeiting money, are not good enough to do this. He was convinced this had to be real. It couldn't have been faked by any means. I've also shown these to I showed the original tracks, to a man who's generally acknowledged as the best fingerprint expert in the United States. He does not work for the FBI. Most of the fingerprint experts I ask will say, hey, do you suppose if I show these to the FBI, what do you think they'd think? And the usual reaction is, oh, not the FBI. Those are a bunch of jerks. They're all involved in politics. They wouldn't know a fingerprint from a footprint anyway. So I asked the various fingerprinters, various sheriff's departments, well, who should I show them to? And they suggest somebody at the state headquarters somewhere. And then every once in a while, someone will pause, almost like they're crossing themselves, and say, well, maybe you could show them to Robert Olson. Like a fool, I asked, well, who the heck is Robert Olson? Oh, they almost cringe. He's God of fingerprinters. He is the top man in the whole United States on fingerprinters. He wrote the book that everyone works out of, and he is considered absolutely tops. So he works in Kansas. So I go to Kansas and find him, and he's happy to look at him, studies them for a few hours, and says, yeah, they're genuine. Could not have been faked. Obviously, they're too big to be human feet. The first toe doesn't stick out like an ape, so it's not an ape's foot, and it wasn't faked. Therefore, it is not any known animal. And if you think there is an 8-foot-tall human-like body walking around leaving footprints, yeah, perfectly reasonable. They've also been seen by some people who are probably the best fingerprint experts in Great Britain and in China and Russia, and they all pronounce them genuine as well. I've shown these same footprints to some of the best anthropologists and zoologists in this country, and they all look at them very briefly and say, it's a fake. And I ask them why. Well, that's obviously finger skin there, but it couldn't be true because there is no such thing. Well, how is it faked? I don't know, just faked somehow. That's the reaction. Well, there's a good reason for the difference between these two groups of people. The anthropologists are all on record as saying there is no such thing as a Sasquatch. Even if they didn't say it as such, they have in their classes given the list of all the living primates, and Sasquatch was not on that list. They'll all have to eat crow if this thing is real. The fingerprinters, on the other hand, work for police departments. Whether they're Sasquatches or not doesn't concern them professionally one bit. They'd be more interested in knowing if somebody's got a way to fake fingerprints. That would be concern to them. So they're free to make any comment they want. That's true of all but the FBI. The FBI head of fingerprinters looked at these, and after a while he finally said, if this thing is true, the implications are just astounding. It can't be true. You notice it was the implications that made him decide, not the anatomy of the thing itself. I also showed them to the recently retired ex-fingerprint head of the FBI. He took them a lot more seriously. He wouldn't quite stick his neck out, but he said, yeah, I think you probably got something there, but I'm not quite sure what. And that's about how we left it. That's sort of what a Sasquatch looks like. Got the frame reversed. This is one frame from Patterson's film. It's not a terribly good thing. It's just walking past. 1 foot and half of a leg is obscured by debris in the foreground. This is a little bit of background part here. This is the hand, the other hand, and the thing is turned and it's looking at the camera at that point. For those of you who don't know what happened with Patterson, I'll just fill it out slightly. Remember, I got that reversed. Patterson was about 200 feet away on a horse, and the Sasquatch appeared, and the horse reared and threw him. The Sasquatch just proceeded to walk like this. Patterson's over there. Patterson got off, got his camera going. Patterson's just a little tiny fellow. Turned the camera on and ran straight towards the creature, who just totally ignored him. He got a little bit less than 100 feet away, stumbled, was on his knees, holding the camera a little more steadily, and the creature turned and looked at him through 2 paces like that, and then kept going. In Patterson's words, I still remember them, it said, "It looked at me with an expression of contempt and disgust." Patterson chose to stay on his knees from there on. And the creature, whatever it was, continued to walk on away from the scene. And his approximately 1-minute film then ends with just the back of the creature. And that's the last you see of it. And that's the only film that I think is real. For those of you who worry about somebody coming up with a film like that and what kind of character the person has, well, I don't doubt for a minute that if Patterson could have faked that, he would have. I wouldn't have trusted him with anything. But he couldn't have. For one thing, the creature was 7 feet tall. We can measure, there's other frames where you can see the length of the foot, and you can multiply that to the height of the body. We have footprint casts that were made at the site, not only by Patterson, who made 2 of them, but by Bob Titmus, who was there some days later and made 8 more. And I've got copies of all of them now. We know how long the actual footprint is. We can calculate then to the stature with the same ratio that's on the film, and it was slightly hunched over, but if it had stood up straight, it would have been 7 feet tall. We also know how wide it is at the shoulders, about 3 feet wide to the outside of the shoulders. A 7-foot-tall man inside of a monkey suit would have shoulders far too narrow for that image. No way would it work. You could, however, put a 7-foot-tall man inside of a monkey suit and have his elbows out and have some sticks in his hands to represent the forearms, and his forearms represent the upper arms, so he just moves these sticks to swing for the arms. Well, he's going to have a little trouble swinging back at that point. But if you had a 7-foot-tall man in a monkey suit with his elbows out, then his elbows are far too wide to fit the image. The only way you can put a human inside a monkey suit to fit that image is to break his arm right in the middle of the upper arm and introduce a new joint. I don't think Patterson had any way that he could have convinced anyone to go through that. Patterson had no particularly large sums of money. Also, if Patterson had faked it, his friend who was with him, a fellow named Bob Gimlin, would have known it was a fake. Bob Gimlin was cheated out of all rights, all profits of it. Patterson made a fair amount of money on it. Bob Gimlin was grumbling about it, and he could have made a lot of money by blowing the whistle on Patterson, telling how it was done. He just sat there and grumbled. So obviously he couldn't see how it could have been done either. Well, now that's the end of the slides, and I want to get to the subject of what to do about this thing. If there are Sasquatches out there, they might be an endangered species. I don't think so. I put my money on them as being fairly well off and comfortable. But I don't know. We may be doing something to the environment that's destroying the Sasquatches. Our pollution, our deforestation, our building, hunting, camping, whatever, our cattle were grazing in their areas. I don't know what we're doing to them. Nobody knows what we're doing to Sasquatches. Nobody knows how many there are, exactly where there are, what their habits are, and what they need. We don't know if they're in trouble. Well, I don't think they are. What do we do if these Sasquatches are in ecological trouble and we are the fault? Well, obviously, nothing's going to happen. Nobody is going to set aside a Sasquatch preserve. Can you imagine what would happen if the governor of one of the Northwest states said, there will now be a Sasquatch preserve such and so on the map? He will not be voted out at the next election. They won't have to. He will not be recalled in an immediate election. It won't happen. He will be carried off to the nut hatchery that very day. You can be sure of it. I have talked to enough government officials to know what they think of the Sasquatch. Absolutely stupid is what they'll tell you. It's what they tell me. Well, they don't quite say it that badly. If they know who I am and what my opinions are, they try to phrase it gently. If they don't know who I am, or they talk to someone else who's unknown, they just say, that is stupid idiocy. Anyone who thinks there's a Sasquatch ought to have his head examined. Anyone who thinks there are lots of Sasquatches is even worse condition. Talk to the government officials yourself. You'll get the same story. You can also ask them, and you can ask the top men at the Smithsonian Institution, what would it take to convince them that there is a Sasquatch? They'll tell you the same thing they've told me. I've got some very good friends at the Smithsonian Institution, top men who are right involved in this area of expertise. They appreciate a lot of my work. They think I'm very brilliant in my anthropological work, and they think I'm an absolute fool for pursuing the Sasquatch. They'll tell you what you need to prove the Sasquatch is a body, right on the table. I've tried to talk to them about what other evidence they would accept. I showed them the fingerprints, every bit of the fingerprints. They'd look at it for 2 minutes, hand it back, and say it's a fake. I asked them about the film. It's obviously a fake. How about all the eyewitness reports? Half of them came out of whiskey bottles, and the other half lied about it. Just dismissed, just like that. Well, there's nothing that's going to convince those people, and they are the people in power. There's nothing that's going to convince them that there are Sasquatches out there without a body. Now, you only need one body, because they are smart enough. They're biologists. They know that if there's one body, there is a species out there. How do you get a body? Several suggestions constantly come up. The one that has constantly come up in the last 3 weeks, especially in letters that I've gotten since the erroneous press reports came out, is why don't you go out and tranquilize one? And then you don't have to kill it, and you can release it. Well, these are people who know all about tranquilizing guns, from the movies and the TV specials. If you go out and try to tranquilize something like a Sasquatch, in the first place, there's no way to get anywhere near one. In second place, even if you shot one, you don't know if you got the right dose of the right drug. You don't know if it's going to come be annoyed and come up and kill you, because you can only shoot from about 100 feet away, or 200 at most. Your drug might not be right, and it might just go away, and you never see it again. It might fall unconscious a half mile away, and you'll never find it, and the bears will have a feast. But even if you did succeed in tranquilizing it, bear in mind what happens when people tranquilize animals today. What you probably don't know out there, except some of you naturalists who are into this, is that when a new species is going to be tranquilized, you can count on something like 10 or 20 of them being killed before you figure out how to do it, what drug to use, how much to use, where to hit it, and where in its environment it is. They'll be dying of the drugs, they'll collapse and they'll suffocate, they'll break their legs doing something, they'll run off a cliff, they'll ram into trees, they mangle themselves all over the place. Even when the technique is worked out, I've heard estimates on the order of 10% failures, death or bad mangling. They don't show you that on the TV specials. If we wanted to get a tranquilized Sasquatch, that's talking a slaughter of a couple of dozen. Not the most bloodthirsty hunter going for that kind of slaughter. Well, then we have the next approach, and that's the hunters. I am not a hunter. I have no experience with big game hunting, and at the moment I don't even own a rifle that would do any more than tickle a Sasquatch. Whether I approve or disapprove of the hunting is irrelevant. I'm not in on it. But there are hunters who reason that if you go out and pick one off, if you can be so lucky, several of them have tried for years and never succeeded, you pick one off, bring in the carcass or a substantial part of it, and the scientific community will have to pay attention. Then people will go out and study it. People who would refuse to study it now couldn't get any money to study it. Then everybody's going to be sending out Jane Goodall and all of her colleagues out there that will study it like mad. And if it needs protection, it will be done. But that requires killing one. Well, in all probability, some hunter is going to settle the question by killing one. If it's going to be settled at all, that's the most likely way it's going to happen. Now, I don't have any money to send hunters out into the field. You'd talk $20,000 a year to put a hunter in the field. I don't have that kind of money. That's $20,000 is more than 2/3 of my salary. And I just manage on my salary. And you'd have to put a lot of hunters out. I can't tell hunters to go out. I can't call hunters back. I can't tell a hunter to go from one area to another. I can't tell them to go work harder. I can't tell them to work less. I have absolutely no control over the hunters. The only influence I have on the hunters is to try to talk to them in terms of the scientific value of the remains. If and when you get it, we want it. Don't just throw it away and save the skin for a rug. And all of the hunters that I am familiar with, they've all either enthusiastically or in a few cases grudgingly agreed, yeah, okay, we'll let you have the bones. Maybe you can let some of your colleagues stick their scalpels in the soft parts. Well, that's about as much influence as I have on that subject. Now, a few years ago, I started to reason that maybe there is another way to get a Sasquatch, and that is to find the skeleton of one that died a natural death. Well, I could ask you, and I don't even have to look to see the raising of hands, how many of you have found a bear that died a natural death? None of you have. I've asked a lot of people, best game officials, game guides, hunters, everything. Not a one has found a bear that died a natural death. How many anything have you found that died a natural death? That is, it was not killed abruptly. It may have been old, sick, poisoned, diseased, whatever, and had a chance to hide itself. Nobody ever finds them. Well, maybe somebody could figure out where to find one. That's where a Sasquatch would be if it dies a natural death. Where's the bear's graveyard? Where's the Sasquatch graveyard? I've asked a lot of people about this who ought to know, who are familiar with animal behavior, and all they can do is guess that a bear and a Sasquatch would probably go for low territory, at least light vegetation or dense, depending on what's available, cool, comfortable, near a supply of water, and where he can be protected. The animal that's dying doesn't know it's dying. He just thinks he's sick and he's going to recover. So he wants to recover in the safest, most comfortable place possible. And that's where he dies. And other animals eat the remains. The bones sink into the ground or get washed downstream in the next spring. Well, I tried to figure out where a Sasquatch would likely go. Went out to a few places following that sort of description. Stand on a roadside or halfway up a hillside, look over a valley, and yeah, if I were a Sasquatch, I wouldn't die all the way over these many square miles. I'd be right down here in this valley, which is only about 300 feet across and a half a mile long, and somewhere down there, there may be a Sasquatch skeleton in the weeds and grass. How would you find it? You take a stick, you walk along, you poke, like so. You take another step and poke, like so. Well, that's 300 feet by half a mile. It would take me several years to go through that one valley. I might find 2 bears and an elk. I have to go through hundreds of valleys like that before I'd have any likelihood of finding a Sasquatch. Okay, searching for the dead Sasquatch like that is a waste of time. But wait a minute. If a Sasquatch dies, it'll probably die in the winter because it didn't put up enough fat supply or whatever it needs to get through the winter. Winter's probably the hard time. Most of the deaths will be during the winter. What happens to a Sasquatch if he dies out here in the hills during the winter? He freezes. What happens in the spring when the thaw comes? He thaws, and then he rots. A decomposing body generates a fair amount of heat, about 5 degrees Celsius. If you had an infrared heat sensor, put it over your eye and looked at a little screen, you could read heat. If I had one here, I could look at and I could see all of your bodies lighting up very brightly, even though I can hardly see you. By visible light, it would show up very clearly in infrared. And if one of you happens to be dead sitting in one of these chairs, I could spot it in a minute because your heat is about 1/4 as much as the person sitting next to you. I didn't bring my infrared, so you might check your neighbor, see if one of you is dead. Well, I did sink $10,000 into an infrared imager. I thought when I got this, which was almost 4 years, over 3 years ago now, that then I would announce to as many people, newspapers I thought would pick up on this, hey, Professor Krantz advocates trying to find a dead body of a Sasquatch without killing one. First time. He's not saying, cheers to the hunters, go for it, which of course doesn't mean a thing. He's saying, we're going to get one without killing one. I thought then the people would come in, the Audubon Society and everybody else who want to save the Sasquatch would come in with the money to support helicopter searches. You have to be above to look down to see the rotting body. I thought, well, yeah, all these people who every once in a while get outraged about the idea of shooting a Sasquatch, well, here's your chance. Put up or shut up. To a man, they shut up. Not one person came forward to help me hunt for the Sasquatch without killing one. A writer for Sports Illustrated came forward to give me 2 hours helicopter time over a prime area, my first and only attempt, in order to write a story ridiculing the whole business. I didn't know that until I saw the story. Well, there I am with $10,000 worth of heat-seeking equipment and no way to get it up in the air. A student of mine found a little ad in an aircraft magazine. Homemade helicopter kit, $2,000. A little picture of it. And I'm thinking, holy cats. You wouldn't catch me, no, you would catch me dead in one of those if I built it. So what did I do? I sent away for it and I built it. It has not flown. A lot of the newspaper articles referred to my high-tech helicopter. It is the lowest tech helicopter that has ever been designed. It is powered by 2 1.5 horsepower engines. These are the smallest gas lawnmower engines you can buy. And they sit up on the rotor blade with little tiny propellers that then spin the big thing around, and I will hang below it in a plastic chair on a bearing. That is, if it works. I have no idea if it's going to work. I've spent several years trying to, well, 2 years now, trying to hook up the throttle controls, a throttle wire that goes up through that and into a spinning thing like that and goes out to 2 different engines simultaneously. That's a little tricky to try to work out. The plans didn't tell you how to do that. They said, just run the throttle controls up there. Yeah, sure, how? Well, I think I've got it all worked out, and I think I'm going to make a first attempt at flying the thing sometime in a couple, 3 weeks from now. Watch the obituary columns in your newspapers. But if it works, I'm going to try to get up over some areas that I think might be the places where Sasquatches will expire. And this means from between 1 and 200 feet, trying to struggle along with this helicopter, lift my heat-seeking thing, try to figure out what I'm doing, where I'm going, and spot large decaying objects. Probably next spring is when I would do it seriously. I'll practice this summer and serious hunt next spring. If I find a large, warm, not hot, but warm object, it could be a dead bear, it could be a dead elk, it could be 4 campers piled on top of one another. And I expect there will be a whole series of things like that before there's any chance of finding a Sasquatch. But at least I'm trying. Now, somehow, the news media got hold of this story 3 weeks ago. I was interviewed over the telephone, and I just today, for the first time, read the AP wire that went out on this 3 weeks ago. And it was not very complete. Some things that I talked about as wild speculation were put down as for serious. But actually, I was a little bit surprised to find that actually the original AP wire wasn't terribly bad. It was just a little bit distorted. But what the newspapers picked out of that wire, they left out the critical qualifiers and alternate and other things and just picked the stuff that they thought the public would look at. And what it turned out is almost every newspaper story that's come out, people constantly have been sending these things to me. It's, professor has high-tech helicopter to go out and blast away Sasquatch. Not a word about that there are lots of them. Not a word about that it's a heat seeker to find a dead body. Not a word about any other qualification, but kill crazy professor. I didn't know quite what to think when I saw some of these things. And I have gotten letters from school children as well as little old ladies and some serious, well, halfway educated people saying this is the stupidest thing they've ever heard of and I'm brutal. And one of the reasons I was particularly happy to come here today, and instead of just giving a normal talk, I thought I would try to straighten out some of this rather obnoxiously bad press that has come out on the subject. Well, I think I'm already a little bit over time here. Maybe we can open up for a few questions. How about some lights on the audience so I can see who's talking? Anybody got a question about the subject? Yes, standing.
Doctor, is there a specific geographical area that most of the sightings have occurred?
The exact geographical area is the forests. I have given you the exact area. I wouldn't qualify it any down from that.
Substantially more evidence in certain areas than in other areas. It can't be so widespread that there are sightings in Minneapolis more than there are in Seattle.
The forests around Minneapolis are very flimsy, but you go a little bit north of it, and there are Sasquatch reports. There are Sasquatch reports from every state of the Union except Rhode Island. That's not to say I believe them, but there are reports. Now, I only deal with the Pacific Northwest, and within the Pacific Northwest, everything that's forested and is not thoroughly human inhabited, it has reports. Now, certain areas get more reports, but that's because that's where the press or some active hunter who's talked to the press happens to be working. But there's a lot of other places where I know privately there's a lot of reports coming out of it, and the press has never heard about it.
My question was
Footprints and sightings from all of these areas. Every forested part of the Pacific Northwest has reports. There's 1,000 eyewitness accounts and over 1,000 footprints scattered all over the place. Yeah, here.
Seems like someone could track some of these things with a dog.
A lot of people, yeah, let me cut you off right away. A lot of people have had dogs in the vicinity of Sasquatches, and the dogs just go absolutely to pieces. Yeah, they are absolutely terrified of it. They cower between the owner's legs, they run the other direction, they hide under the car, and no dog has even had the slightest inclination to follow it. I know I sometimes think that I should bring my Irish wolfhound along on a Sasquatch hunt, but my reasoning is he's going to be excellent for finding a Sasquatch. When he suddenly bolts in sheer terror in that direction, I will look that way. Yeah. I'm talking about bear hunting, trained dogs, excellently trained dogs, absolutely terrorized. They'll die before they'll go after it. Yeah, a lot of people have tried. Absolutely nothing. Yeah.
If, in fact, there is a Sasquatch, and there seems to be a very large number of them sighting in the spring, which would mean maybe the snow is pushing them down and they survive during the winter. Is there any chance possibly that they could be a hibernator or an excavator like a black bear is?
We've seriously wondered about that. How do they get through the winter? And we don't know. What I used to think was, since the reports decrease in the winter, but only to about half, and then come back up again, that they couldn't be real sleepers like bears, but they would just have to cut down their activity. But then again, human activity out in their areas is a lot reduced during the winter. So maybe it's us, not them, that are less active. Then I thought, well, maybe they lay up a big supply of fat to help get them through the winter. But it suddenly dawned on me, not too long ago, that any nocturnal animal during the winter has a much longer feeding day than any other time of year. So whatever they're eating, they have a lot more time to go around scrounging for it during the winter. So I don't know what they do in the winter. I don't think they sleep. I don't think they sleep it off. I think they remain active. They may reduce in activity, or they may increase. We just don't know. That's a nasty problem. Yeah.
It occurred to me they didn't have one whale of a mating procedure. Would there be any sounds that maybe different sightings could attribute to some type of mating call or language between the Sasquatch, like any other animal?
Well, one of the problems is, right off the bat, though there's a lot of claims about sounds of Sasquatches, one of the questions I've been looking for an answer to is, has anyone seen a Sasquatch inhale, open his mouth, and let out a sound as he's exhaling? That is, you hear a sound from that direction when you see this thing inhale and exhale. Only one person has ever made that claim. Turned out later he was lying about it. Nevertheless, there are a lot of sounds out there that a lot of very good woodsmen say cannot be any known animal. Sometimes they may be right, sometimes they may be wrong. Maybe the woodsman isn't as good as they thought he was. There are sounds. Certainly the Sasquatch must, well, almost certainly must make some sounds, but I don't know which sounds they're making. So I wouldn't even begin to figure out what's a mating call, what's an alarm call, and what's a food call. I wish I could be more helpful on that, but we just don't have enough information on sounds. Yeah.
Is there, from what I understand, is there a strong odor associated with Sasquatch?
Yes. A Canadian man, John Green, has the best files, the most detailed records of all Sasquatch sightings, and he's noted this, of course, and he added up from all of the reports he's got now, well, at the time he added them up, there was almost 1,000 of them. He found that a strong or definable bad odor occurred in less than 5% of the cases. Now, that's all sighting cases, which includes an awful lot of them at great distances. But even the sightings of right up close, it's still a minority. I've talked to a few people personally who've been right close to them. A couple of cases they said it's an overwhelming stench, very foul, and others said, oh, I didn't notice a thing. Now, we have several theories on this. One is they eat carrion, and that is the source of the odor. It becomes a body odor, and another one may not have been eating any carrion for some time. Another is just personal uncleanliness, unhygienic. They don't